I distinctly remember my gut reaction years ago when I was still in school and Apple officially revealed the first iPad. I was in the campus library, probably reading Engadget, and I thought to myself, man, would you look at that giant iPhone? And I mention this because for a long time after that day, when it came to software, Apple basically treated the iPad like a giant iPhone. Things began to change a few years ago. iPads started to get distinct features like better multitasking, a Mac-style dock, and stylus input. And all of that leads us to now, and to iPadOS. Don't let the name fool you though. iPadOS, or I guess more specifically iPadOS 13.1, is still basically iOS with some tablet-specific features, but the fact that iPadOS is a thing at all seems like a clear signal that the paths taken by iPhones and iPads will diverge even more in time. For Apple's tablets, this is the first step down that new path, and I have to say, it's a pretty strong one. Before we go any further, just a few quick notes. First, I have to admit, I was a little apprehensive about installing the final version of iPadOS, considering just how buggy iOS 13 was before the 13.1 update. For more on that whole thing, be sure to check out our full written review, which we've linked down in the comments below. Turns out I really didn't need to worry all that much. iPadOS has been surprisingly stable, even during its beta phase. I should also point out that I haven't had the chance to thoroughly test Sidecar, the feature that lets you connect an iPad to a Mac for use as a graphics tablet or a secondary display. As we're shooting this video, macOS Catalina isn't out yet, so I'll update my written review once I can try the feature out with some final software. Since iPadOS shares a common foundation with iOS 13 and 13.1, all of those features you might have heard of, like dark mode and updated maps and photo apps, a more natural sounding Siri, they're all here. That said, you are going to notice a few differences right off the bat. Check out this home screen. It's full of smaller app icons, and not counting the dock, you can squeeze up to 30 of them onto a single screen. The kinds of quick actions you get by long pressing an app icon on an iPhone have finally made its way to iPads too. If you need even more info, you can actually lock the Today screen and all of its widgets to the side of the home screen. That's pretty much it for sweeping visual changes though, unless you count the dark mode that I already mentioned. Here's the really interesting thing though. iPadOS might not look dramatically different from what you're used to, but the web actually might. No matter what version of the iPad you're using, Safari will show you the full-fat desktop version of a website. There's no watered-down mobile versions here. I love this. If you're an iPad owner, you've invested in a bigger screen, so you should be able to see the full extent of what the web has to offer. I have to point out, this is all because iPadOS basically tells every site that you're visiting that this isn't an iPad, it's a Mac, and it's running the full version of Safari, which I think is actually pretty funny. More importantly, this new update finally plays nice with web apps and services that it simply could not deal with before. Google's productivity apps are probably the best example. I edited the lines I'm saying right now in Google Docs, in Safari, on an iPad, which would have been, at best, seriously frustrating not that long ago. That'll mean more to some of you than others, but I think it nicely speaks to how iPadOS helps Apple's tablets level up when it comes to actually getting stuff done. And there's a lot more than just that too. For years now, iPads have had two main multitasking tools, slide over and split view, and both of them have gotten some pretty notable upgrades this time. With the former, you can be putzing around in one app, long press another in your dock, and drag it over to the side of the screen to stick that new app in a floating window. This year though, all of the apps you stick over in that slide over panel continue to live there even after you dismiss the window. Just swipe across the bottom of that panel to thumb through them one by one. If you need to find something specific, you swipe up from the bottom to see all of them at once. Slide over is probably the feature I use most on iPads. It's really helpful when you're focused on something in that main window and just need a little extra context from a Google search or an email or something. You will have to do a little prep work though. Since you can only use slide over with apps living in your dock, you have to make sure that the stuff you use pretty frequently is there in advance. With split view, you can have two apps running side by side, same as always. The difference here is that you can now break out parts of some apps into second windows of their own. So let's say you're sifting through your folders in the Files app. You can grab one of them, drag it to the side of the screen, and start looking at the contents of that folder, all while looking at your original nested setup. It's not as immediately helpful as slide over, especially since figuring out what can and can't be opened in split view requires a lot of trial and error, but it is a nice thing to have. This next bit applies to regular iOS 13 too, but it's just too pertinent to ignore. Just like on iPhones, iPadOS finally lets you create folders, download files, and organize them locally on your iPad. That is right, you can finally download files straight to your iPad. The Android fan in me is just bemused that it took this long for Apple to make it happen, but whatever. Unsurprisingly, iPadOS's Files app is better for managing your stuff since it has more screen space to play with. It has a Mac-like column view that makes it easy to dig into all of your nested folders, plus a much larger contextual menu with options for moving and copying and even compressing your files. If you have an iPad Pro, you can really play around. Since they have standard USB-C ports, there's really nothing stopping you from plugging in a thumb drive or an SSD or a portable hard drive even, and moving files to and fro as needed. Are most people gonna do this? No, but it's nice to know that the ability is there for anyone who does actually have to rely on it. Hell, you can even use a mouse with iPadOS if you really wanted to, which I would not recommend. You have to dig into your tablet's accessibility settings to enable assistive touch, plug in the mouse or connect it via Bluetooth, make sure the sensitivity is set to a manageable level, define what, if anything, you want the other buttons to do, and then finally get down to business. It does work, but just keep this in mind. This is an accessibility feature. It is 100% not going to suddenly turn an iPad into a Surface Pro. Some of these changes may seem arcane, and you're not wrong. It really does feel like Apple is trying to curry favor with its power users who want more nuanced control over their gadgets. iPad Pros, you might say. Point is, there is a decent learning curve here if your focus on getting stuff done outweighs your need to use your iPad for Netflix and Apple Arcade. Thankfully, not every change Apple made here was designed to close the gap between iPads and more traditional computers. Some of them are just helpful. I have always hated how, unless you had a physical keyboard connected to it somehow, iOS's on-screen keyboard eats up like a third of the screen. Now that is completely optional. iPadOS lets you switch into an iPhone-sized floating keyboard that makes it way easier to type with a single thumb or swipe out a message when you're holding an iPad in both hands. If you're a fan of the Apple Pencil, the delay from the moment you start drawing to when you see your strokes appear on screen has been cut roughly in half. You might not notice that difference unless you're really paying attention, but it does actually make the pencil feel just a little bit more natural. Tap home. If your mobility is limited, or if you'd rather talk at your iPad than touch it, voice control offers some seriously granular control over everything that's on your screen. With a little practice, you could do anything on your iPad with your voice just as you could with your hands, just maybe not as fast. At the end of the day, I can't help but feel that iPadOS is a more significant update than iOS 13. Not only does it include more stuff, it also suggests that we'll start to see the feature gap between iPhones and iPads grow wider before long. Good, that's the way it should be. Apple has long insisted that the iPad represented its vision for the future of computing, and it's about time the software that powers it all really steps it up.